This is David Goldman, Asia Times Deputy Editor, speaking to you from New York City, the evening of April 12th. The April 13th release of the Consumer Price Index for March by the U.S. government will be an extremely closely watched event for an obvious reason. Never in history has a government managed to run a staggering budget deficit in the range of 15 to 20% of gross domestic product and print money at an astonishing record pace without inflation being the result. But if you believe the Federal Reserve, inflation simply isn't a problem. Year on year, the non-food and energy, or so-called core component of America's Consumer Price Index, showed a print of only 1.3% in February, and the consensus says that it will only be 1.5% in March. Now, the Federal Reserve seems to have a magic number in the back of its mind of 2% inflation, so everything is copacetic. The Federal Reserve can maintain easy monetary policy, continue to buy trillions of dollars worth of Treasury debt. The United States government continue to spend like a drunken sailor, and all will be well. Or will it? Well, part of the problem is it's not inflation if the government says it's not. Here's the difficulty I have. If you look at the chart of the day, you'll see at the bottom of the chart there are some lines which barely budge. For example, there's a line for the shelter component of the Consumer Price Index, which shows a gain of only 1.3% year on year as of February. Now, shelter is the most important thing most people buy. In fact, it makes up 1/3 of the whole Consumer Price Index. But look at that dotted line at the top of the graph. That's the year-on-year gain in the American home prices according to the Case-Shiller Index, and that's been growing at nearly 12% a year. So how is it possible for the cost of shelter to barely budge in the Bureau of Labor Statistics reckoning, while the price of a home that you go out and buy and pay for is up by nearly 12% year on year? Well, this has to do with certain weirdnesses in government calculation. There's a thing called owner equivalent rent that no one can quite understand. That's the rent that I would pay myself to live in my own house if I had one, and so forth. More importantly, if you look at the cost of shelter for many Americans, there happens to be a freeze on evictions. Because of the COVID-19 crisis, you can't be evicted even if you don't pay the rent, which means your rent is not likely to change very much. It's also much harder to move. So tens of millions of people are frozen in place. Their rents are effectively frozen. And that leads to a weird distortion in the statistics. There are some other weirdnesses. For example, why should new car prices be only growing at a bit over 1% a year? Auto production is down by a quarter, mainly because of the global shortage of semiconductors, and electronics make up about 2/5 of the value of a car. So this is the hypothetical increase in the price of a car that you can't buy because it's not being produced. So overall, I see stagflation, I see production shortages, I see constrictions on the supply side, and I see unlimited demand pushing prices up. So I think that the Consumer Price Index is profoundly distorted to the downside, and the reason people will be watching the number is everybody's waiting for the day when market reality eventually catches up with the federal numbers, as it must. And when that happens, be afraid, be very afraid. This is David Goldman speaking to you from New York City.